Now, for the last two Allied leaders, Charles de Gaulle of France and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. First, Charles de Gaulle. He had been an army officer. Later, he's going to get into the government. Around the time when World War II is starting, he is basically the leader, the head political person in France. And when the Nazis invaded, France this time around does not put up much of a fight at all. Um, Ultimately, Charles de Gaulle decides as the Nazis get closer and closer to Paris that he needs to flee. He needs to leave Paris and basically allow the Nazis to take over France. This is a move that he gets widely criticized for among the people in France. A lot of people, saw this as gutless, as hey, you are deserting us in our time of need. Reality, and a little bit of hindsight tends to treat him a little more fairly. The reality is that if he stays in Paris, chances are he's probably arrested. Um, and he's not going to be able to do much while he's a prisoner of war. Instead, he flees the country. He winds up, leading the French resistance, trying to organize things within France against the Nazis, but he does it from afar. The reality is that's probably the right move. It's probably the only move that he really could have made and still made a difference. But it is something that he's going to be criticized for. After the war is over, he comes back and well, in the grand scheme of things, history is going to treat him a little bit better. The airport is actually named Charles de Gaulle Airport now, so the history has looked on him a little bit better than the people really at the time did. The last Allied leader is going to be Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin was originally from a part of the Soviet Union called Georgia. It is a small country, an independent nation today. He was the general secretary of the Communist Party. They wind up calling that the Soviet premier. He actually is going to be the second leader of the Soviet Union. The first one was going to be Vladimir Lenin. Then you have Joseph Stalin. Now, Joseph Stalin comes up as just kind of a common thug. He was the guy who was willing to do the things that other people weren't in order to gain power. So when Lenin dies, there's really nobody that's going to stand in his way. He was making major changes to how communism was going to work. The government was taking over everything within the country. He was somebody that had an awful lot actually in common with Adolf Hitler. If you look at their upbringing, you look at the things that their parents did, the things that their mothers wanted for them, wanted them to go to religious schools, wanted them to ultimately be priests. Um, but Stalin, like Hitler, was not somebody that was going to buy into it. He was very artistic, but ultimately he had so much in common with Hitler. They were going to sign a non-aggression pact. Hey, you don't attack us, we won't attack you. Stalin intended to keep that promise. Hitler, it was just a way to stall. He learned lessons from World War One and applied that here in World War II. So he keeps the Soviets out of World War II long enough for them to take over, and that ultimately is going to be a reason, for Stalin to wind up getting into the war because Hitler turns on him. He is going to be the leader throughout, and at the end of the war, he is going to be in charge of one of the few superpowers left in the world. That is going to mean that they are going to influence greatly how Eastern Europe is set up after the war is over. He's also going to be responsible for killing millions of his own people, much the way Hitler did as well.